The sun cast long shadows across the dusty platform of Sweet River Junction as Florence Bennett clutched her wedding dress to her chest, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. The train that had carried her hundreds of miles from Boston to this frontier town in Wyoming territory had departed, leaving her alone with her trunk, her dreams in tatters, and the mocking laughter of onlookers who had witnessed her humiliation. "Looks like another mail-order bride got herself stood up," a voice called out from the gathering crowd. It was 1878, and the West was still wild, untamed, and often cruel to those who didn't belong. Florence pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from the prying eyes and whispered comments. She had traveled all this way to marry a man she'd only exchanged letters with, Harold Wilkins, a store owner who had painted such a lovely picture of their future together. Now she stood abandoned, the object of public ridicule in a strange town where she knew not a soul. Poor thing probably sent an old photograph. A woman in a garish yellow dress remarked loudly enough for Florence to hear. Men hate being deceived that way. Or maybe he took one look at her from the hotel window and changed his mind. Another chimed in with a cruel laugh. Florence bit her lip, willing herself not to break down in front of these strangers. She was 22 years old, had sold everything she owned back east to make this journey, and now found herself utterly alone with no prospect of shelter for the night, let alone a future. As the taunting continued, a tall figure pushed through the crowd. Florence looked up to see a man in a worn leather vest and dusty Stetson standing before her. His face was tanned from years under the open sky, his eyes the clear blue of a mountain lake. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense of Boston society. His face was too weathered, his jaw too strong, but there was something arresting about him. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced the crowd. "You folks got nothing better to do than torment a lady in distress." The spectators shuffled uncomfortably, a few drifting away under his stern gaze. The man turned to Florence, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Name's Everett James, madam. Ranch hand at the Double Creek spread north of town." He offered a calloused hand. "May I help you with your trunk?" Florence hesitated, her mother's warnings about strange men ringing in her ears. But what choice did she have? I'm Florence Bennett," she managed. "I was supposed to meet my fiancé, but it seems he's had a change of heart." Everett's expression darkened. "Harold Wilkins." When she nodded, he sighed. "Figured as much. Man's got a reputation for this sort of thing. You're the third lady he's invited out here, only to leave stranded." Fresh tears welled in Florence's eyes. "The third?" She felt doubly the fool now. "Don't you worry about that now," Everett said gently. "Let me help you find a place to stay tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out what's next." He extended his hand again, and this time Florence took it, feeling its strength and warmth. Without further ado, Everett lifted her heavy trunk onto one shoulder as if it weighed nothing, offered her his arm, and began to lead her away from the station. "Where are we going?" Florence asked, acutely aware of the stares following them. "My sister runs a boarding house at the edge of town," Everett explained. "Proper place, respectable. She'll have a room for you." As they walked down the main street of Sweet River Junction, Florence took in the rough-hewn buildings, the saloon with its swinging doors, the general store with goods displayed in dusty windows. It was so different from Boston's neat brick edifices and cobblestone streets. "I don't have much money," she admitted quietly. "I spent most of it on the train ticket." Everett nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "Eleanor, that's my sister, she'll understand. Maybe you can help around the place until you get your bearings." Florence studied his profile as they walked. "Why are you helping me, Mr. James?" He was quiet for a moment, adjusting the trunk on his shoulder. "Out here, folks need to look out for one another. The West isn't kind to those who stand alone." They turned down a side street, the buildings growing more sparse until they came to a two-story white clapboard house with a neat garden. A sign hung from the porch, "Eleanor's boarding house." Everett led her up the steps and opened the door. "Eleanor," he called. "Got someone here who needs a room." A woman appeared from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She had the same blue eyes as Everett, though her hair was a darker blonde, pulled back in a practical bun. "Everett, I wasn't expecting you until—" She stopped when she saw Florence, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding. "Another one of Wilkins's brides." Florence felt her face flame with embarrassment, but Eleanor quickly crossed the room and took her hand. "Don't you fret, dear. That man has a special place waiting for him in the hereafter, I'm sure of it. I'm Eleanor James. Come on in and sit down. You must be exhausted." Before Florence knew it, she was seated at a wooden table with a cup of hot tea in front of her, Everett having disappeared upstairs with her trunk. "He's putting it in the blue room," Eleanor explained, setting out a plate of biscuits. "It's small but comfortable. You can stay as long as you need to get sorted." "I'm afraid I can't pay much," Florence began, but Eleanor waved her concern away. "We'll work something out. Can you cook?" "So. I could use help with the laundry and mending for my boarders." "I can do all of those things," Florence replied, relief washing through her. "I worked as a seamstress in Boston." "Perfect," Eleanor said with a satisfied nod. "We'll talk details tomorrow. For now, just rest." Everett returned, hat in hand. "Room's all set," he said. "I've got to get back to the ranch, but I'll check in on you in a few days, Miss Bennett." "Thank you," Florence said, rising from her chair. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Get some rest, madam. Things always look brighter in the morning." After he left, Eleanor showed Florence to her room, small indeed, but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the garden. "Bathrooms down the hall," Eleanor explained. "Supper's at 6, but I'll have something set aside for you if you'd rather rest." Left alone, Florence sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to cry. She wept for her foolishness, for her lost dreams, and for the uncertainty of her future. But as her tears subsided, she felt a strange sense of relief. Perhaps this was a fortunate escape from a man who would treat any woman so callously. She unpacked her few belongings, including the wedding dress she had so carefully made by hand. Looking at it now, she felt nothing but a dull ache. She folded it away in the trunk, a reminder of lessons learned. As the sun set over Sweet River Junction, Florence washed her face, tidied her hair, and went downstairs to join the other boarders for supper. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she had survived today. And in the untamed wilderness of Wyoming Territory, sometimes that was victory enough. The next morning, Florence woke to sunlight streaming through the lace curtains of her small room. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting the familiar sounds of Boston carriages on cobblestones, the calls of street vendors. Instead, she heard the distant lowing of cattle and the cheerful chatter of birds unfamiliar to her eastern ears. Reality crashed back as she remembered yesterday's humiliation. She was thousands of miles from home, abandoned by a fiancé she'd never met, in a town where she knew no one save a kind cowboy and his sister. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Florence, are you awake?" Eleanor's voice was gentle. "Breakfast is ready downstairs when you are." "Thank you," Florence called back. "I'll be down shortly." She dressed in her plainest day dress, a serviceable blue cotton that had seen better days but was comfortable for travel. As she pinned her chestnut hair into a simple knot, Florence studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her hazel eyes looked back at her, still puffy from yesterday's tears but clearer now. Her mother had always called her pretty in a quiet way, not a beauty who would turn heads but pleasant to look at. Had Harold Wilkins found her wanting? The thought still stung. Downstairs, she found a lively breakfast table. 4 men and 2 women, all boarders, Alina explained, were enjoying plates piled high with eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Everyone, this is Florence Bennett," Alina announced as she pulled out a chair. "She'll be staying with us for a while and helping me with the cooking and sewing." The boarders welcomed her warmly. There was Mr. Peabody, the town's schoolteacher, the Simmons brothers who worked at the lumber mill, Mrs. Wilson, a widow who gave piano lessons, and Miss Clark, a quiet woman who worked as a telegraph operator. "We heard what happened at the station yesterday," Mrs. Wilson said, patting Florence's hand. "Shameful behavior from that Wilkins fellow, and from the townspeople too." "Your brother was very kind," Florence replied, looking at Alina. "I don't know what I would have done if he hadn't intervened." Alina smiled. "Everett has always had a soft spot for people in trouble, been that way since we were children." "How long have you been in Sweet River Junction?" Florence asked, accepting a plate from Alina. "Going on 5 years now," Alina replied. "Came out with my husband Thomas after the war. He passed 2 winters ago pneumonia. Everett came to help me run things, but he's always been more comfortable on horseback than in town, so he took work at the Double Creek Ranch." After breakfast, the boarders dispersed to their daily activities, and Florence helped Alina clear the table. "I thought you might help me with the mending today," Alina suggested. "Several of the men have shirts in need of repair, and I've fallen behind." "I'd be happy to," Florence replied. "It's the least I can do for your kindness." The day passed quickly as Florence lost herself in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Alina was easy company, sharing stories of the town and its inhabitants as they worked. "So Harold Wilkins owns the general store?" Florence asked, curious about the man who had so callously abandoned her. Alina nodded, her expression souring. "Inherited it from his father 3 years ago. Store's successful enough, only one in town, but Harold's got notions above his station. Keeps writing to women back east, promising them the moon and stars, then finding some excuse when they arrive." "But why?" Florence couldn't fathom the cruelty of it. "Some men just like the power," Alina said with a sigh. "Or maybe he gets cold feet. Either way, he's a coward." By late afternoon, Florence had repaired 6 shirts and darned numerous socks. Her fingers were sore, but her heart was lighter. There was comfort in useful work. A commotion outside drew their attention. Alina went to the window. "Riders coming in," she remarked. "Looks like some of the Double Creek boys." Florence joined her at the window, her heart skipping when she recognized Everett among the group of dust-covered cowboys trotting down the street. Unlike yesterday, he was smiling, laughing at something one of his companions had said. The sight transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and bringing a warmth to his eyes that was visible even at a distance. "Looks like they're heading to Sullivan's," Alina noted, referring to the town's main saloon. "Saturday tradition after a hard week's work." "Your brother seems well liked," Florence observed. "Everett's a good man," Alina replied simply. "Too good sometimes for his own well-being." She glanced at Florence with a thoughtful expression. "Why don't you take a break? The mercantile's still open if you need anything." "Wilkins won't be there. He leaves his assistant to mind the store on Saturdays while he goes hunting." Florence hesitated. "I don't have much money to spend." "You've earned something for today's work," Alina insisted, pressing a few coins into her hand. "Go on. It'll do you good to see more of the town in daylight." 20 minutes later, Florence found herself on the main street, taking in the sights of Sweet River Junction with a clearer eye than yesterday. The town wasn't large, perhaps 30 buildings in all, with the train station at one end and the sheriff's office at the other. In between were the typical establishments of a frontier settlement: the general store, the saloon, a small church, a bank, a barber shop, and various other businesses. She paused outside Wilkins' general store, steeling herself before pushing open the door. A bell tinkled overhead, announcing her arrival. A young man looked up from behind the counter. "Afternoon, madam," he greeted her. "What can I help you with today?" "Just looking," Florence replied, scanning the shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to fabric, from tools to patent medicines. "You're new in town," the clerk observed. "Just arrived yesterday, didn't you?" Florence nodded, wondering if he knew of her connection to his employer. "I'm Benjamin," he offered. "Ben to most folks. I work for Mr. Wilkins." "Florence Bennett," she replied, deciding honesty was best. "I believe Mr. Wilkins was expecting me." Ben's friendly expression faltered. "Oh, Miss Bennett. Yes, Mr. Wilkins mentioned. That is, he said there'd been a misunderstanding about your arrival date." Florence raised an eyebrow. "Is that what he called it?" The young man flushed. "Madam, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but Mr. Wilkins, he sometimes, well, he's particular about arrangements. Particular enough to leave a woman stranded at a train station." Florence's voice was sharper than she intended. Ben looked genuinely distressed. "It's not right what he does. I've told him so, but he just laughs it off. Says the women are better off without him anyway." "On that point at least we agree," Florence said dryly. A ghost of a smile crossed Ben's face. "If you're staying in town, I hope you'll still feel welcome to shop here. I give fair prices, regardless of what Mr. Wilkins might say." Florence felt a small measure of her anger dissolve. "Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that." She purchased a few necessities, a cake of soap, some hairpins, and a spool of thread, and was just turning to leave when the door opened again, the bell jangling loudly. Everett James stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking surprised to see her. "Miss Bennett," he greeted her. "Didn't expect to find you here." "Just picking up a few things," she explained, suddenly conscious of her plain appearance compared to yesterday when she'd been dressed in her best traveling suit. Everett nodded to Ben. "Came for that order of fence staples, Ben. Foreman needs them first thing Monday." "Got them right here, Mr. James," Ben replied, pulling a package from beneath the counter. "Mr. Wilkins said to put it on the ranch account." "Much obliged," Everett said, taking the package. He turned to Florence. "Heading back to Aliner's?" "Yes," she replied. "I've been helping her with mending today." "Mind if I walk with you?" he asked. "My horse could use the rest, and I'd like to check in on my sister anyway." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the dusty street. Florence was acutely aware of Everett's tall presence beside her, of the curious glances from townspeople as they passed. "How are you settling in?" he asked, adjusting his stride to match hers. "Your sister has been very kind," Florence replied. "She's given me work to do, which helps." "Aliner mentioned you're a seamstress from Boston." "Yes, I worked for a dressmaker there." Everett nodded thoughtfully. "Skilled work, might be a need for that here. Town's growing." "I've been thinking about that," Florence admitted. "I can't stay at your sister's forever, living on charity." "Aliner doesn't see it that way," Everett assured her. "But I understand wanting to make your own way." They walked in companionable silence for a moment. Florence found herself studying his profile again, the strong jawline, the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken once, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes. "Mr. James," she began, "I never properly thanked you for yesterday. You saved me from a truly mortifying situation." Everett looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "But they didn't," Florence pointed out softly. "You did." He met her eyes then, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. The moment was broken by a shout from across the street. "Well, if it isn't the jilted bride!" Florence's stomach dropped as she saw Harold Wilkins himself emerging from the saloon, flanked by two companions. He was a portly man in an expensive suit, his face flushed with drink. "Didn't expect to see you still in town, miss," he called, swaggering across the street toward them. "Most of them catch the next train out." Everett stepped slightly in front of Florence, his posture tensing. "Keep walking, Wilkins. You've done enough damage." Wilkins ignored him, addressing Florence directly. "No hard feelings, I hope. You're just not what I pictured from your letters. A man has to be particular about who he marries. You understand." Florence felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment this time, but from anger. "And a woman should be equally particular, Mr. Wilkins. It seems we've both had a fortunate escape." Wilkins's face darkened. "Now see here. The lady asked you to move on," Everett interrupted, his voice low but carrying a clear warning. Wilkins glanced at Everett, seeming to register the cowboy's imposing presence for the first time. Whatever he saw in Everett's expression made him reconsider his approach. "Just being friendly," Wilkins muttered, backing away. "No need to get riled up, James." As Wilkins and his friends retreated, Florence let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you again," she said quietly. Everett shook his head. "Man's a fool," he said simply. Then, with a slight smile, he added, "and blind too, apparently." The compliment, oblique as it was, brought a flush to Florence's cheeks. Before she could respond, they arrived at Alina's boarding house. "Will you come in?" Florence asked. "I'm sure Alina would love to see you." Everett hesitated, then shook his head. "Best get back to the boys. We're riding out early tomorrow, moving cattle to the north pasture." "I see," Florence said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Well, thank you for the escort." He tipped his hat to her. "Miss Bennett," he said by way of farewell, but he lingered a moment longer than necessary before turning to leave. Florence watched him walk away, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within her. She had come to Wyoming to marry a man she had never met, only to be rejected by him and then rescued by another. The irony wasn't lost on her. But as she climbed the steps to Alina's porch, she realized that for the first time since arriving in Sweet River Junction, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost, but rather what might lie ahead. The following weeks fell into a rhythm for Florence. Mornings were spent helping Alina prepare breakfast for the boarders, followed by laundry or cleaning. Afternoons were devoted to sewing, not just mending now, but also creating new garments. Word had spread quickly that a skilled seamstress from Boston was staying at Alina's, and orders had begun to trickle in. A new Sunday dress for the banker's wife, shirts for the Simmons brothers, alterations for Mrs. Wilson's outdated wardrobe. Alina had cleared a small room at the back of the house for Florence to use as a workroom, moving in a table, her sewing machine, and plenty of natural light from 2 windows. Florence found peace in this space, losing herself in the familiar tasks that had defined her life in Boston. "You've got quite the clientele developing," Alina remarked one afternoon, bringing Florence a cup of tea. "Mrs. Sullivan was singing your praises at church yesterday, said the dress you altered for her daughter made the girl look positively fashionable." Florence smiled, setting aside the shirt she was working on. "It's satisfying work. I'm grateful for it." "Grateful enough to consider staying?" Alina asked casually, though her eyes were watchful. The question caught Florence by surprise. She had been in Sweet River Junction for nearly a month now, and while she'd thought about her future, she hadn't made firm plans. Her original ticket had been one way, and returning to Boston would mean admitting defeat, something her pride resisted. I've been thinking about it, she admitted. If there's enough work, I could perhaps rent a small place, set up properly as a dressmaker. Alina nodded, looking pleased. The widow Parker's cottage might suit. It's been empty since she moved to Denver to live with her daughter. Nothing fancy, but it has 2 rooms and a kitchen. Might be perfect for living and working. I couldn't afford to buy property, Florence cautioned. Rent then. Parker's daughter would be glad of the income, I'm sure, and you've already saved a bit from your work here. It was true. Florence had been careful with her earnings, setting aside most of what she made from sewing jobs. I'll think about it, she promised. It's a big decision. Alina squeezed her shoulder. No rush. You're welcome here as long as you need. Later that evening, as Florence sat on the porch enjoying the cooler air after a warm day, she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart quickened as Everett James appeared, riding his bay gelding at an easy trot. Over the past month, he had made a habit of stopping by whenever his duties at the ranch brought him to town, which seemed to be happening with increasing frequency. Sometimes he would stay for dinner, other times just long enough for a cup of coffee and a brief conversation. Florence found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. "Evening, Miss Bennett," he called, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post. "Alina around. She's helping Mrs. Wilson with a cake for tomorrow's church social," Florence replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Won't you sit for a moment? It's a lovely evening." Everett hesitated, then removed his hat and took the offered seat. "It is at that," he agreed, looking out at the sunset painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink. "Days are getting shorter. Fall will be here before we know it." "Is autumn very harsh here?" Florence asked. "I've only experienced eastern seasons." "Can be," Everett said. "Early snows sometimes. Wind that cuts right through you. But there's beauty in it, too, the way the aspen leaves turn gold up in the mountains, the clear air, the stars that seem close enough to touch on cold nights." Florence studied him as he spoke. Everett James was not a man of many words typically, but when he did speak at length, it was often about the land. His love for Wyoming territory was evident in his voice, in the way his eyes softened when describing its features. "You were born here?" she asked. He shook his head. "Missouri originally. Family came west after the war. Father thought there'd be more opportunities. He was right in a way, though he didn't live to see much of it. Died our second winter here." "I'm sorry," Florence said softly. Everett shrugged. "Long time ago now, Alina and I made our way. She married Thomas. I worked the cattle drives, then smaller ranch jobs. Found I had a knack for horses, breaking the wild ones." "That sounds dangerous," Florence observed. A smile touched his lips. "Can be. Got this the hard way," he said, pointing to the crook in his nose. "Stallion objected to my methods, taught me respect that one did." "And now you work at Double Creek Ranch, head wrangler there," he confirmed. "Good outfit, fair boss, could do worse." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Florence was aware of a pleasant tension between them, a sense of possibilities unspoken. "Alina says you're considering staying in Sweet River," Everett said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "I am," Florence admitted. "There seems to be a need for my skills here, and I've grown fond of the place." "Glad to hear it," Everett said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made Florence glance at him. He was looking at her intently, his blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Town could use more folks like you." Before Florence could respond, the front door opened and Alina appeared. "Thought I heard your voice, brother," she said cheerfully. "Staying for supper." Everett broke eye contact with Florence, turning to his sister. "If it's no trouble." "Since when have you ever been trouble?" Eleanor teased. "Come on in, both of you. Food's nearly ready." During supper, Florence was quieter than usual, her mind replaying the moment on the porch. There had been something in Everett's gaze, something that suggested his interest in her staying in Sweet River Junction went beyond civic pride. The thought was both thrilling and frightening. She had come west to marry a man she knew only through letters, a decision that had ended in humiliation. Could she trust her judgment again so soon? And yet, Everett James was nothing like Harold Wilkins. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet integrity that shone through in his actions rather than his words. After the meal, as Everett prepared to leave, he paused at the door where Florence stood saying goodbye. "There's a social at the church tomorrow after services," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "Thought you might like to attend. I could, escort you if you'd care for company." Florence felt a flutter in her chest. "I'd like that very much, Mr. James." "Everett," he corrected gently. "Think we've known each other long enough now." "Everett," she repeated, liking the feel of his name on her lips. "Then you must call me Florence." A smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "Florence," he said, as if testing it. "I'll see you tomorrow, then." As she watched him ride away into the gathering darkness, Florence felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced since before her ill-fated journey west. Tomorrow suddenly couldn't come soon enough. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Florence dressed with particular care in her best dress, a deep green wool with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. She had altered it recently, updating the style to better suit current fashions while maintaining its practicality for frontier life. "You look lovely," Eleanor commented as Florence came downstairs. "Green suits you brings out the gold in your eyes." "Thank you," Florence replied, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Is it appropriate for church? I don't want to appear too—" "Too what? Pretty," Eleanor laughed. "It's perfect. And Everett will think so too," she added with a knowing smile. Florence felt her cheeks warm. "I'm simply trying to make a good impression on the community." "Of course you are," Eleanor agreed, her eyes twinkling. "Now let's go, or we'll be late." Sweet River Junction's church was a simple white wooden building with a modest steeple, situated at the eastern end of town. As they approached, Florence saw that most of the town's residents were already gathering outside, dressed in their Sunday best, exchanging greetings and news. She felt eyes turn her way as she walked beside Eleanor, curious glances, a few whispers. While many had met her through her sewing work, this was her first public appearance at a community gathering. She was still, to some extent, the bride who was left at the station, and she felt the weight of that identity as she climbed the church steps. "Miss Bennett, Eleanor." A friendly voice called. Florence turned to see Reverend Collins, a kindly man in his 50s who had been one of her first sewing clients, needing his worn coat repaired. "So pleased you could join us today." "Thank you, Reverend," Florence replied. "It's a beautiful morning for services." "Indeed it is," he agreed. "God's glory is particularly evident in Wyoming skies, I always say. Please come in and find a seat. We're about to begin." Inside, the church was filling rapidly. Florence followed Eleanor to a pew near the middle, nodding politely to those she recognized. She was scanning the room, looking for a particular tall figure when a hush fell over the congregation. She turned to see what had caused the reaction. Harold Wilkins had entered the church, looking prosperous in a fine suit, a young woman on his arm. The woman was perhaps 19 or 20, blonde and pretty in an expensive-looking dress that Florence recognized as being from last year's Godey's Ladies' Book patterns. "That's Charlotte Mills," Eleanor whispered. "Daughter of the bank owner. Wilkins has been courting her for weeks." Florence felt a strange mixture of emotions, not jealousy, Precisely, but indignation on behalf of the young woman who clearly had no idea about Wilkins's character. Before she could dwell on it further, there was movement beside her, and Everett slipped into the pew next to her. He was dressed in what was obviously his best outfit: clean dark trousers, a white shirt, and a string tie. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd recently bathed, and he smelled faintly of soap and bay rum. "Morning," he said quietly, his eyes taking in her appearance with clear appreciation. "You look very nice." "Thank you," Florence replied, suddenly shy. "As do you." The service began, but Florence found it difficult to concentrate on Reverend Collins's sermon about community and Christian charity. She was acutely aware of Everett beside her, of his large hand resting on the pew between them, of the occasional brush of his arm against hers when he shifted position. After the service concluded, the congregation moved to the church hall for the social. Tables had been set up with refreshments: cakes, pies, sandwiches, and coffee. Children ran about playing games while adults gathered in small groups, chatting. "Can I get you something to eat?" Everett asked, hovering close to Florence as they entered the hall. "Yes, thank you," she replied. "Whatever looks good." As Everett moved toward the refreshment table, Florence found herself approached by several women she'd sewn for, all eager to introduce her to others. "Mrs. Parker, this is Miss Bennett, the seamstress I was telling you about, Mrs. Sullivan said, bringing forward an elderly woman. "She did the most wonderful work on Emily's dress." "Pleased to meet you," Florence said, shaking the woman's hand. "Your daughter owns the cottage Alina mentioned might be available to rent." Mrs. Parker nodded. "Sarah's in Denver now, married to a lawyer. Left me the cottage, but at my age I preferred to join her there. It's sitting empty, going to waste." "I'd be very interested in seeing it," Florence said eagerly. "I'm looking to establish myself properly as a dressmaker here." "Are you indeed, Mrs. Parker?" looked pleased. "Well, that's wonderful news. Town needs a good seamstress. I'll have Sarah write to you about terms." As Mrs. Parker moved away, Florence felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Perhaps Sweet River Junction could become home after all. Everett returned with 2 plates of food and guided her to a quieter corner where they could sit. "Saw you talking with Mrs. Parker," he commented. "Alina mentioned you might take the cottage." "It sounds promising," Florence agreed. "If the terms are reasonable, it would give me a proper place to work and live." Everett nodded, looking thoughtful. "It's a good location, close enough to town for business but not right in the thick of things. Solid little place from what I remember." "You've been inside." "Helped Thomas Alina's husband repair the roof a few years back after a storm." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Be good to have you settled nearby. If you decide to stay, that is." "I think I will," Florence said softly. "There doesn't seem to be much waiting for me back east." Everett looked as if he wanted to say more, but they were interrupted by a commotion across the room. Harold Wilkins had entered the hall with Charlotte Mills, making a beeline for the refreshment table. As they passed, Wilkins spotted Florence and Everett, his step faltering momentarily. Florence held his gaze steadily, refusing to show any discomfort. After a moment, Wilkins nodded stiffly and continued on his way. "Man's got nerve," Everett muttered. "He's not worth the energy it would take to be angry," Florence replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Though I do worry for Miss Mills, bank owner's daughter," Everett explained. "Wilkins is likely after her father's money and connections." "Should someone warn her?" Florence wondered aloud. Everett shook his head. "Mills knows Wilkins's reputation. If he's allowing the courtship, he must have his reasons. Besides, folks have to make their own mistakes sometimes." They finished their meal, and afterward Everett suggested a walk. The afternoon was pleasant. The sun warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze stirring the cottonwood trees that lined the creek running behind the church. As they strolled along the bank, Florence found herself relaxing in Everett's company. He wasn't a man who felt the need to fill silence with chatter, which she appreciated. When he did speak, his observations were thoughtful, often insightful. "You miss Boston?" he asked as they paused to watch a hawk circling overhead. Florence considered the question seriously. "Parts of it," she admitted. "The libraries, the theaters, the bustle of a big city, the ocean." She smiled at a memory. "My father used to take me to the harbor to watch the ships coming in. I loved imagining where they'd been, what exotic goods they carried." "Never seen the ocean myself," Everett said. "Can't quite picture that much water in one place." "It's magnificent," Florence told him. "Terrifying and beautiful at once. Rather like your Wyoming skies, I suppose." Everett glanced at her with appreciation. "You understand, then? Some folks come west and see nothing but emptiness. Others see possibility." "And which did you see?" she asked. "Possibility," he answered without hesitation. "Always have." He hesitated, then added, "Still do." There was something in his tone that made Florence look up at him. His blue eyes met hers, serious and intent. Slowly he reached out and took her hand in a simple gesture, but one that sent a ripple of warmth through her. "Florence," he began, "I know you came here expecting one thing and found another. I know it's not been easy. But I want you to know that Miss Bennett," a young voice called, breaking the moment. "Miss Bennett, Mama says to come quick." They turned to see 10-year-old Tommy Sullivan running toward them, red-faced and excited. "What is it, Tommy?" Florence asked, reluctantly releasing Everett's hand. "Fight at the social," the boy exclaimed. "Mr. Wilkins and Ben from the store. Ben said something about Mr. Wilkins being mean to ladies, and Mr. Wilkins hit him." Everett was already striding back toward the church, Florence hurrying to keep up. They could hear the commotion before they reached the hall, raised voices, the crash of something breaking, women's cries of alarm. Inside, they found chaos. Tables had been overturned, food scattered across the floor. In the center of the room, Harold Wilkins stood red-faced and disheveled, his fine coat torn. Across from him, young Ben from the general store was being restrained by two men, blood trickling from his lip. "You're fired," Wilkins was shouting. "You'll never work in this town again, you insolent pup." "Don't care," Ben shot back. "Someone needed to say it. You're a liar and a cheat, and Miss Mills deserves to know the kind of man you are." Charlotte Mills stood to one side, looking pale and confused. Her father, a stern-faced man in an expensive suit, had a protective arm around her shoulders. Reverend Collins was trying to restore order. "Gentlemen, please. This is God's house. I must insist, stay out of this, Reverend," Wilkins snapped. "This boy has slandered me in public, and I demand satisfaction." Everett moved forward, positioning himself between Wilkins and Ben. "That's enough, Wilkins. Take a walk, cool your head." "Mind your own business, James," Wilkins snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns everyone when you disrupt a peaceful gathering," Everett replied evenly. "Especially when you're in the wrong." "The wrong?" Wilkins's face purpled. "That boy accused me of improper behavior toward women, in front of the whole town, in front of my future father-in-law." "Is it untrue?" Everett asked quietly, his voice carrying in the suddenly silent room. "Did you or did you not invite Miss Bennett here all the way from Boston with promises of marriage, only to abandon her at the station? And was she the first?" All eyes turned to Florence, who felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. She had wanted to put that humiliating episode behind her, not have it dragged into public view again. But as she looked at the faces around her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few disapproving, she realized that the shame wasn't hers to bear. It belonged to Harold Wilkins, whose true character was finally being exposed. "It's true," she said clearly, stepping forward to stand beside Everett. "I received multiple letters from Mr. Wilkins, promising marriage and a good life here in Sweet River Junction. I sold my possessions, left my home, and traveled thousands of miles based on those promises. When I arrived, he was nowhere to be found, leaving me to be mocked by half the town." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Charlotte Mills had gone even paler, looking at Wilkins with dawning horror. "It was a misunderstanding," Wilkins stammered. "I never intended—" "You intended exactly what happened," Ben interrupted. "You've done it 3 times that I know of. You keep the letters in your desk at the store. I've seen them." Mr. Mills stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "Is this true, Wilkins?" "George, you can't possibly believe—" "Answer the question," Mills demanded. "Have you been corresponding with women back east, bringing them here under false pretenses?" Wilkins looked around desperately, seeing no sympathy in the faces surrounding him. "It was just a bit of fun," he said weakly. "No real harm done. No harm." Florence couldn't contain her indignation. "I gave up everything I had. And what about the other women? What became of them?" "One went to work for the saloon girls," Ben said grimly. "The other bought a ticket back east with money she borrowed from the widow Parker. Never heard if she made it home." Charlotte Mills pulled away from her father and approached Wilkins. Without a word, she removed the small diamond ring from her finger and dropped it at his feet. Then she turned and walked out of the hall, head held high. "Charlotte," Wilkins called, moving to follow her. "Mr." Mills blocked his path. "Stay away from my daughter, Wilkins. Our business arrangements are terminated, effective immediately. You'll be hearing from my lawyers about the store's mortgage." The social effectively over, people began to disperse, talking in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed. Florence stood rooted to the spot, feeling strangely numb. The public exposure of Wilkins's deception should have been satisfying, but mostly she felt tired and sad that such ugliness had marred what had been a pleasant day. Everett touched her elbow gently. "Let me take you back to Aliner's," he said quietly. Outside, the beautiful day continued unaffected by human drama. As they walked in silence toward the boarding house, Florence gradually became aware that Everett was watching her with concern. "I'm all right," she assured him. "Just overwhelmed." "I'm sorry," he said. "Didn't mean for all that to happen. Wouldn't have brought it up if Wilkins hadn't been acting the injured party." "No, I'm glad you did," Florence replied. "The truth needed to come out for Miss Mills's sake if nothing else." They had reached Aliner's porch. Florence turned to face Everett, suddenly remembering that they'd been interrupted at a significant moment before the commotion at the church. "You were saying something," she prompted. "By the creek, before Tommy came." Everett looked down at his hat, which he was turning in his hands. "Was just going to say, I'm glad you're thinking of staying, in Sweet River, I mean." Florence sensed there had been more to it, but she didn't press. "So am I," she said simply. He met her eyes then, and in his gaze she saw warmth, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart beat faster. "May I call on you again?" he asked. "Properly, I mean, not just stopping by to see Aliner." Florence smiled. "I'd like that very much, Everett." He returned her smile, and for a moment they stood in companionable silence, each reluctant to end the moment. Finally, Everett put his hat back on and tipped it slightly. "Until next time, then," he said softly. As Florence watched him walk away, she felt a sense of possibility unfurling within her like a map of unknown territory, waiting to be explored. Sweet River Junction might not have been her intended destination, but perhaps it was where she was meant to be all along. The following week brought significant changes to Florence's life in Sweet River Junction. Mrs. Parker's daughter responded quickly to her inquiry about the cottage. offering terms that were more than fair. By Wednesday, Florence had signed a 6-month lease and was preparing to move her belongings from Alina's boarding house to her new home. The cottage itself was even more suitable than Florence had hoped. Located on a quiet lane just a 5-minute walk from the main street, it consisted of 2 good-sized rooms, a small kitchen, and a covered porch. The front room had large windows that would provide excellent light for sewing, while the back room would serve as her bedroom. It was simple but well built, with a small stove for heat and cooking, and a pump in the kitchen that meant she wouldn't have to carry water from the community well. "It's perfect," Florence told Alina as they stood in the empty front room. "I can set up my sewing machine by the window, put a table here for cutting fabric, maybe a small settee there for clients to sit during fittings. You'll need furniture," Alina pointed out. "I can loan you a bed and table to start with." "That's very kind, but I've been thinking." Florence hesitated. "I have some savings from my work these past weeks. There's a furniture maker in town, isn't there, Mr. Jensen?" Alina nodded. "Makes good sturdy pieces, not fancy, but they'll last." "Then I'll commission what I need from him," Florence decided. "It's important to me to establish myself properly, to support the community as it's supported me." Alina smiled approvingly. "You're thinking like a local already." The rest of the day was spent cleaning the cottage thoroughly and making lists of what would be needed. By evening, Florence was exhausted but satisfied. As she and Alina walked back to the boarding house for what would be one of her last nights there, they met Everett riding into town. He reined in his horse when he saw them, his face lighting up with a smile that made Florence's heart skip. "Ladies," he greeted them, tipping his hat. "Out for an evening stroll. We've been preparing Florence's cottage," Alina explained. "She's moving in this weekend." "Is that so?" Everett looked at Florence with interest. "The Parker place," Florence nodded. "The terms were very reasonable. I'll be able to set up my dressmaking business properly there." "That's good news," Everett said. "I'd be happy to help with the moving if you need it." "That would be wonderful," Florence replied, trying to keep her voice casual despite the pleasure his offer gave her. "I don't have much, but Alina has kindly offered to loan me some furniture until I can purchase my own." "Actually," Alina interjected, "I just remembered I promised to help Mrs. Wilson with her preserving on Saturday. Everett, you'll have to manage without me." Florence shot Alina a look, recognizing the transparent attempt at matchmaking, but Everett just nodded agreeably. "Not a problem," he said. "I'll bring the wagon around Saturday morning if that suits you, Miss Bennett, Florence," she reminded him with a smile. "And yes, Saturday would be perfect." That's settled. Everett tipped his hat again and continued on his way, though not before giving Florence a look that lingered in her mind long after he'd gone. "You're not very subtle," Florence told Alina as they resumed walking. Alina chuckled. "At my age, there's no time for subtlety. Besides, I've never seen my brother look at anyone the way he looks at you." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "It's too soon to be thinking that way. We barely know each other." "Sometimes you know what's right without needing a lot of time," Alina said wisely. "Thomas proposed to me after 3 weeks' acquaintance. We had 20 good years together." The idea of marriage, which had been Florence's purpose in coming west now, seemed both more distant and somehow more real than it had when she was corresponding with Harold Wilkins. With Wilkins, it had been an abstract concept, a means to an end. The feelings stirring within her for Everett were something else entirely warm, vital, and a little frightening in their intensity. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. Florence had packed her few possessions and was ready when Everett arrived with the wagon. He had brought not only the vehicle but also a small table and 2 chairs. "From the bunkhouse," he explained as he loaded her trunk. The boys won't miss them, and you'll need somewhere to eat until you get your own." "That's very thoughtful," Florence said, touched by his consideration. The move itself didn't take long, but setting up the cottage occupied most of the day. Everett proved to be surprisingly adept at domestic arrangements, helping position the furniture for maximum space and light, hanging curtains that Alina had sewn, and even fixing a loose floorboard that Florence hadn't noticed. By late afternoon, the cottage had been transformed from an empty shell to a cozy home. Florence stood in the center of the main room, looking around with satisfaction. "It's lovely," she said. "I can hardly believe it's mine, even if just for 6 months." "Could be longer," Everett observed, wiping his hands on a rag after lighting the stove to take the evening chill off. "If your business does well, which it will," he added confidently. "I hope so," Florence replied. "I've already scheduled 3 fittings for next week, and Mrs. Sullivan has commissioned a new dress for her daughter's birthday." Everett nodded approvingly. "You've made quite an impression in a short time." He hesitated, then added, "Not just on your customers." Florence met his eyes, feeling that same flutter in her chest that his presence increasingly caused. "I'm glad to hear it," she said softly. For a moment, they stood looking at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Everett cleared his throat and glanced out the window. "Getting on toward evening," he said. "I should be going, let you settle in." "Oh," Florence said, unable to hide her disappointment. "Of course." Everett reached for his hat but paused before putting it on. "Unless you might be hungry. I could bring back some supper from the hotel restaurant. Celebrate your first night in your new home." Florence smiled, relieved. "I'd like that very much." After Everett left, Florence moved about the cottage, making small adjustments, placing her few personal items where they would bring her the most joy: a small porcelain figurine that had been her mother's on the mantel, a book of poetry on the bedside table, a colorful quilt Alina had insisted she take across the back of the borrowed settee. She had just finished washing her face and tidying her hair when Everett returned, carrying a covered basket that smelled deliciously of roast chicken and fresh bread. "Mrs. Davis at the hotel was very interested to hear about your new place," he reported as Florence set the table. "Says she'll be coming to see you about a new dress for her niece's wedding." "Word travels fast in a small town," Florence observed, arranging the food. Everett had brought not just chicken and bread, but also roasted potatoes, green beans, and apple pie for dessert. "Blessing and a curse," Everett agreed. "Not much privacy, but when times are hard, folks know who needs help." They sat down to eat, the conversation flowing easily between them. Everett told stories of his work at the ranch, of the characters among the cowboys, of a particularly stubborn horse he was training. Florence shared memories of Boston, of the dressmaker's shop where she had worked, of her dreams for her own business. As darkness fell, Everett lit the lamps, casting a warm glow throughout the cottage. Outside, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. "I should go," Everett said reluctantly after they had finished the pie. "Early start tomorrow at the ranch." Florence walked him to the door. On the threshold, he turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "I meant what I said before," he told her. "You've made quite an impression, on me especially." Florence's heart raced. "And you on me," she admitted. Everett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm, calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "May I call on you again tomorrow? After church, perhaps?" "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Florence replied honestly. A smile spread across his face, transforming his features in a way that made her breath catch. Then, still holding her hand, he leaned down and pressed his lips softly to her cheek. "Good night, Florence," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "Good night, Everett," she whispered back. After he left, Florence closed the door and leaned against it, her fingers touching the spot where his lips had been. Outside her window, the Wyoming night spread vast and star-filled, full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. The weeks that followed were the happiest Florence could remember. Her dressmaking business flourished, with orders coming in steadily as word spread of her skill with needle and thread. The front room of her cottage became a proper workshop, with fabric samples, pattern books, and a dress form she had commissioned from Mr. Jensen, the furniture maker. Her personal life blossomed as well. True to his word, Everett called on her regularly, sometimes for planned outings like a Sunday drive or a picnic by the creek, other times just stopping by with a small gift. Wildflowers he'd picked on the trail, a book he thought she might enjoy, once even a kitten he'd rescued from a tree near the ranch, a tiny calico she named Thimble, who quickly made herself at home among the fabric scraps. Their courtship, for that was clearly what it had become, progressed with a sweet deliberateness that Florence found both frustrating and endearing. Everett was unfailingly respectful, always conscious of her reputation in the small town. The kiss on her cheek that first night in her cottage had been followed by others on her hand, her forehead, once daringly at the corner of her mouth, but he had not yet kissed her properly, something Florence found herself thinking about with increasing frequency. October brought the first frost, painting the countryside with autumn colors. Florence had never seen anything like the aspen groves Everett had described, their leaves transformed into shimmering gold against the dark green of the pines. He took her riding one crisp Saturday to see them, lending her a gentle mare from the Double Creek Ranch. "It's beautiful," Florence breathed as they sat on horseback at the edge of an aspen grove, the leaves rustling in the breeze, sunlight filtering through them to create patterns on the forest floor. "Told you," Everett said, looking pleased at her reaction. "Worth the ride." "Absolutely," she assured him, though she was still getting used to being on horseback. In Boston, she had occasionally ridden in the park, but always side saddle and never for more than an hour. Today they had been riding for several hours, and despite the divided skirt she had made specifically for the purpose, she knew she would be sore tomorrow. Everett must have seen her shift uncomfortably, because he suggested they dismount and rest for a while. He spread a blanket in a sunny clearing and they sat enjoying the simple lunch he had packed: sandwiches, apples, and coffee from a thermos. "Winter will come early this year," Everett remarked, looking at the sky. "Can feel it in the air. Is that bad?" Florence asked, pulling her shawl closer around her shoulders against the cool breeze. "Can be, if you're not prepared." He studied her face. "First Wyoming winter's always the hardest for folks from back east. Your cottage is well built, but you'll need plenty of firewood, warm clothes, maybe extra blankets." "I've been saving to buy a proper winter coat," Florence told him, "and Alina's been teaching me to knit. I've almost finished a scarf." Everett nodded approvingly. "Good. Don't want you getting chilled." He hesitated, then added, "Been meaning to ask, the lease on your cottage, it's up in February, isn't it?" "Yes," Florence confirmed, curious about his question. "Mrs. Parker's daughter wrote that she's happy to extend it if I wish, though the terms might change slightly." "And do you wish to extend it?" Everett's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes were intent on her face. Florence considered the question. "I think so. Business is good, and I've come to love Sweet River Junction more than I expected to." "Glad to hear it," Everett said softly. Then, more briskly, "We should head back soon. Don't want to lose the light." As they packed up the remains of their lunch, Florence wondered about the conversation. Had Everett been leading up to something? The thought sent a flutter of anticipation through her. The ride back to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Florence's cottage, the setting sun cast long shadows across the lane. Everett dismounted first, then helped Florence down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a moment after her feet touched the ground, he didn't let go, and they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the leather and pine scent that seemed to cling to his clothes. "Thank you for today," she said, looking up at him. "It was wonderful." "My pleasure," he replied, his voice lower than usual. His eyes dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in them. Florence felt her breath catch. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand to his cheek, her fingers brushing against the stubble there. It was all the invitation Everett needed. He leaned down, closing the distance between them, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but when Florence responded, sliding her hand to the back of his neck, it deepened into something more passionate, more urgent. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing faster. Everett rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "Been wanting to do that for a while," he admitted, his voice husky. "I've been hoping you would," Florence confessed, smiling up at him. Everett chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Guess I shouldn't have waited so long." "Better late than never," she teased, feeling light-hearted and giddy. He kissed her again, more briefly this time, before reluctantly stepping back. "I should get these horses back to the ranch," he said, "but I'll see you tomorrow after church." "I'll be waiting," Florence promised. That night, as she prepared for bed, Florence found herself humming a tune she couldn't quite place, her body still tingling from Everett's kisses. How different this feeling was from what she had expected when she journeyed west to marry Harold Wilkins. That had been a practical decision, based on letters that had painted a pleasing but ultimately false picture. What she felt for Everett had grown naturally from real experiences, from seeing his character revealed in his actions day after day. As she blew out her lamp and settled under the covers, Thimble curled at her feet, Florence realized with sudden clarity that she was falling in love with Everett James, or perhaps had already fallen. The thought was both thrilling and frightening. Her heart had been bruised upon her arrival in Sweet River Junction. Was she ready to risk it again so soon? But Everett wasn't Harold Wilkins, she reminded herself. He had proven himself trustworthy in 100 small ways, and the way he looked at her, the way he held her. There was something real there, something worth taking a chance on. With that comforting thought, Florence drifted off to sleep, dreaming of aspen leaves turned to gold and blue eyes that saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one ever had before. The following weeks saw Florence and Everett's relationship deepen and strengthen. Their Sunday afternoon outings became a regular fixture, eagerly anticipated by both. Sometimes they would drive out to the countryside in a buggy Everett borrowed from the ranch. Other times they would simply walk along the creek or sit on Florence's porch, talking for hours about everything and nothing. As November arrived, bringing colder weather and occasional snow flurries, Everett made good on his promise to ensure Florence was prepared for winter. He delivered a cord of firewood, stacking it neatly at the side of the cottage, and spent a Saturday checking the cottage for drafts, sealing windows and the edges of doors with strips of cloth Florence provided. "That should keep the worst of the cold out," he said with satisfaction as he finished the last window. "And I've spoken to Alina about you spending the worst storms at the boarding house, just in case. Old houses like this can get mighty cold when the temperature really drops." "I appreciate your concern," Florence told him, handing him a cup of hot coffee, "but I'm tougher than I look. Boston winters aren't exactly mild." Everett smiled, taking the cup. No doubt about your toughness. Still, Wyoming blizzards are something else. When the snow's blowing so hard you can't see your hand in front of your face, and the wind's howling like a pack of wolves, even the oldest settlers get worried. Then, I'll be sure to heed any warnings, Florence promised. I have no desire to freeze to death in my first Western winter. Everett's expression grew serious. Don't even joke about that, he said quietly. Lost 2 good men on the ranch last winter when they got caught in a sudden storm. Found them in the spring, not half a mile from the bunkhouse. Florence's smile faded. I'm sorry, she said, touching his arm gently. I didn't realize. He covered her hand with his own. Just want you safe, that's all. The sincerity in his voice warmed her more than any fire could. I know, she said softly, and I will be. Their eyes met, and Florence saw in his gaze all the feelings he hadn't yet put into words: concern, affection, and something deeper that made her heart race. They had shared many kisses since that first one after their ride to the aspen grove, each more passionate than the last, but always Everett maintained a certain restraint, mindful of her reputation and his own sense of propriety. Now, setting aside his coffee cup, he drew her into his arms, holding her close as if reassuring himself of her presence, her safety. Florence leaned into him, savoring the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart under her cheek. Florence, he murmured into her hair, I'm not a man of many words, as you know, but I need to tell you. These past months, knowing you, being with you, it's been the happiest time of my life. Florence pulled back slightly to look up at him, her heart full. And mine, she whispered. Everett took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. What I'm trying to say, not very well, is that I love you, have for a while now, I think. Though she had suspected, hoped that his feelings matched her own, hearing the words spoken aloud sent a wave of joy through Florence so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. I love you too, Everett, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. More than I thought possible. The smile that spread across his face was like the sun breaking through clouds. He cupped her face in his hands, looking at her with wonder, then lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that expressed everything words could not: tenderness, passion, promise. When they finally parted, both breathless, Everett rested his forehead against hers. There's something else I want to ask you, he said, his voice husky. But not yet. Need to make some arrangements first. Will you be patient with me a little longer? Florence's heart leaped. Could he be thinking of marriage so soon? But then, as Alina had pointed out, sometimes you knew what was right without needing a lot of time. I can be patient, she assured him, though her pulse quickened at the thought of what his question might be. Everett kissed her once more, then reluctantly pulled away. I should go, he said. Got an early start tomorrow driving cattle to the lower pasture before the next storm hits. Will I see you next Sunday? Florence asked, walking him to the door. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, he promised with a grin. Though I might stop by before then if I can get away from the ranch. After he left, Florence moved about the cottage in a happy daze, Everett's declaration replaying in her mind. He loved her, and she loved him. After all the disappointment and humiliation of her arrival in Sweet River Junction, who could have predicted such happiness? Later, as she worked on a dress for Mrs. Sullivan's daughter, Florence found herself dreaming of a different white gown one she might wear herself, not too many months from now. The wedding dress she had brought from Boston, the one made for her marriage to Harold Wilkins, was still packed away in her trunk, a reminder of false promises. But perhaps it was time to design a new one that would represent not a practical arrangement, but a true union of hearts. The thought made her smile as she bent over her sewing, the winter wind whistling around the eaves of the cottage, powerless against the warmth within. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing the harshest winter weather Florence had ever experienced. Snow fell for days at a time, piling up against buildings and making the roads nearly impassable. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of windows, and Florence found herself keeping a fire going in the stove day and night just to maintain a bearable temperature in the cottage. Despite these challenges, her spirits remained high. Her business continued to thrive, with customers willing to brave the weather for fittings and consultations. And though Everett's duties at the ranch kept him busier than usual, winter meant constant work ensuring the cattle had access to feed and water. He still managed to visit at least twice a week, often bringing supplies or helping with chores like clearing the path to her door. As Christmas approached, Sweet River Junction took on a festive air despite the harsh conditions. Evergreens appeared in windows, ribbons and candles adorned the church, and the general store, now run by young Ben, Harold Wilkins, having sold the business after his public disgrace, displayed an array of modest gifts and treats. Florence found herself caught up in the holiday spirit, sewing special gifts for her friends, a warm shawl for Elena, embroidered handkerchiefs for the ladies at church, a new shirt for Everett with finer stitching than he would ever buy for himself. She even made a tiny bed for Thimble from scraps of fabric and cotton batting, which the kitten, now growing into a sleek young cat, immediately claimed as her favorite spot. One evening, about a week before Christmas, Florence was putting the finishing touches on Everett's shirt when a knock came at her door. Surprised to have a visitor so late and in such weather, for it was snowing heavily, she opened it to find Everett himself on her doorstep, his hat and shoulders covered in snow, his cheeks red from the cold. "Everett," she exclaimed, pulling him inside, "what are you doing out in this storm? Come warm yourself by the stove." "Couldn't wait," he said, removing his hat and coat which she hung near the stove to dry. "Got something to show you." Despite the cold, his eyes were bright with excitement. From his pocket, he produced a folded document which he handed to Florence with an air of barely contained anticipation. "What is this?" she asked, unfolding the paper. It appeared to be a deed of some kind. 40 acres, Everett explained, watching her face closely. "Good land about 2 miles outside town. Creek running through it, some nice timber, enough flat ground for a house and garden, maybe a few horses." Florence looked up from the document, confused. "You bought land?" Everett nodded, suddenly looking nervous. "Been saving for it for years. Just finalized the purchase yesterday." He took a deep breath, then reached for her hands. "Florence, I know this might seem sudden. We've only known each other a few months, but I love you, and I hope you feel the same." Florence's heart began to race as she realized where this conversation was heading. "I do," she assured him. "You know I do." Everett's grip on her hands tightened slightly. "I'm not a wealthy man," he continued. "Don't have much besides my savings and now this land. But I'm hardworking and I've got plans. Going to build a house come spring, start breeding horses, always been good with them, and there's a market for well-trained stock. Could make a good living, enough to support a family." He paused, swallowing hard, then looked directly into her eyes. "What I'm trying to say, Florence, not very elegantly, is that I want to marry you. Want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Though she had suspected this was coming, had even hoped for it, the reality of the moment left Florence momentarily speechless. She looked at Everett, this man who had rescued her from humiliation on her first day in Sweet River Junction, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who had gradually won her heart with his quiet strength and unwavering integrity, and knew with absolute certainty what her answer would be. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, Everett, I will marry you." The smile that lit his face was like nothing she had ever seen, pure joy, unrestrained and transformative. He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of exuberance, and spun her around once before setting her down and kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally broke apart, Everett reached into his pocket again and produced a small box. "Almost forgot," he said with a sheepish smile. "Not much of a ring, I'm afraid. Nothing fancy." Opening the box, Florence found a simple gold band with a small, perfect pearl set in the center. "It's beautiful," she breathed, genuinely touched by its understated elegance. "Belonged to my mother," Everett explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "Eleanor's been keeping it for me. Said she always knew I'd find the right woman someday." The ring fit as if it had been made for her. Florence looked up at her fiancé, with tears of happiness in her eyes. "I love you, Everett James," she said softly. "And I can't wait to be your wife." They spent the rest of the evening by the stove, talking of their future plans. Everett described the house he wanted to build, nothing grand but solid and comfortable, with plenty of room for a family. Florence shared her thoughts about continuing her dressmaking business, perhaps from a dedicated room in their home. They discussed a wedding date, early spring, before the busy season at the ranch. Whether to have a large celebration or a smaller one, they agreed on modest but joyful, and 100 other details that suddenly needed decisions. As the evening grew late and the storm outside intensified, Florence reluctantly mentioned that Everett should probably return to the ranch before the roads became completely impassable. "Actually," he said, looking slightly embarrassed, "I already spoke to Eleanor about that. She suggested I might stay at the boarding house tonight, given the weather. It's closer than the ranch, and the foreman knows not to expect me back." "That's sensible," Florence agreed, though part of her wished he could stay right where he was, continuing their happy conversation through the night. But such an arrangement would be improper, even for an engaged couple, and both were conscious of maintaining appearances in their small community. At the door, Everett kissed her once more, lingering as if reluctant to leave even for the short walk to Eleanor's. "Still can't quite believe you said yes," he murmured against her lips. Florence smiled up at him. "Did you really doubt I would?" "Man always has doubts when his whole future happiness is at stake," Everett replied seriously. "Especially a man who never thought he'd be lucky enough to find someone like you." Those words warmed Florence long after Everett had disappeared into the swirling snow, long after she had readied herself for bed, and lay listening to the wind howling around the eaves of her cottage. She fell asleep with her left hand cradled against her cheek, the pearl of her engagement ring cool against her skin, dreaming of spring and new beginnings. The news of Florence and Everett's engagement spread quickly through Sweet River Junction, meeting with universal approval. Eleanor was especially delighted, having hoped for just such an outcome from the moment she had seen her brother and Florence together. She immediately began planning a celebration dinner at the boarding house, inviting their closest friends to share in their happiness. "Nothing elaborate," she assured Florence, who was worried about imposing. "Just a chance for folks to wish you well before Christmas." The dinner, held on the Sunday before Christmas, was indeed a warm and cheerful affair. The boarding house dining room was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, the table laden with Eleanor's best cooking roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and an array of pies for dessert. The guests included the Reverend Collins, Mrs. Sullivan and her daughter Emily, Ben from the general store, and to Florence's surprise, Charlotte Mills and her father. "Wanted to congratulate you properly," Charlotte explained when Florence expressed surprise at their presence. "After everything that happened with, well, you know who." It's heartening to see a genuine love match. Thank you, Florence replied, touched by the young woman's sincerity. And how are you faring? Charlotte smiled, a genuine expression that lit up her pretty face. Quite well, actually. Father has been letting me help at the bank, just simple tasks, mind you, but I find I have a head for figures. And she lowered her voice conspiratorially. Ben has been calling on me. Father approves, which is something of a miracle. Florence glanced across the room to where Ben was engaged in conversation with Everett. The young man's face animated as he described something with enthusiastic gestures. He seems like a fine person, she observed. One of integrity. He is, Charlotte agreed warmly. Sometimes good things come from unfortunate beginnings, don't they? If not for that awful scene at the church social, I might have made a terrible mistake with Harold Wilkins. And I might never have come to Sweet River Junction at all if not for his deception, Florence mused. Life takes unexpected turns. To unexpected turns, Charlotte said, raising her glass of lemonade in a small toast. The evening continued with good food, better company, and eventually music when Mrs. Wilson sat down at Aliner's piano. Florence found herself watching Everett as he conversed with the other guests, struck anew by how fortunate she felt. This man, thoughtful, honorable, kind, would soon be her husband. The realization filled her with a quiet joy that bordered on disbelief. As if sensing her gaze, Everett looked up and met her eyes across the room. The smile he gave her, intimate, full of promise, sent a warm shiver through her. He excused himself from his conversation with Mr. Mills and made his way to her side. "Happy?" he asked quietly, taking her hand. "Completely," she assured him, leaning slightly against his shoulder. "Though it still seems like a dream sometimes." "If it is, I hope we never wake up," Everett replied, squeezing her hand gently. Later, as the party began to wind down, Reverend Collins raised his glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," he announced, his kindly face beaming. "To Florence and Everett, may your union be blessed with love, health, and prosperity, and may the good Lord grant you many years together." "To Florence and Everett," the guests echoed, raising their glasses. As Florence looked around at the smiling faces of her friends, for they were truly friends now, not just acquaintances, she felt a swell of gratitude. In just a few months, this small frontier town had become more of a home to her than Boston had been since her parents' passing. After the guests had departed and Florence was helping Aliner clear the table, her future sister-in-law broached a subject that had been on Florence's mind as well. "Have you thought about your wedding dress?" Aliner asked, wrapping leftover bread in a cloth. Florence hesitated. "I have, actually. I brought a wedding dress with me from Boston, the one I made for my intended marriage to Harold Wilkins." Aliner's eyebrows rose. "And would you want to wear that? Might hold bad memories." "That's what I've been considering," Florence admitted. "Part of me thinks it would be wasteful not to use it. It's a beautiful dress, and I put so much work into it. But another part feels it would be, I don't know, tainted somehow." "Understandable," Aliner said thoughtfully. "Though there's something to be said for reclaiming it, too. Taking something meant for an unhappy beginning and transforming it for a joyful one instead." Florence considered this perspective. "I hadn't thought of it that way. Perhaps I could alter it, significantly change the style, add new lace, make it truly mine rather than something designed to please a man I never really knew." "Exactly," Aliner nodded approvingly. "A fresh start, using the good parts of the past without being bound by them." The metaphor wasn't lost on Florence. Wasn't that exactly what she was doing with her life here in Sweet River Junction? Taking the skills and experiences from her past, but reshaping them into something new and better suited to her true self. "I think that's exactly what I'll do," she decided. "Thank you, Aliner. "What are sisters for?" Alina replied with a warm smile. "And speaking of sisters, I've been meaning to tell you I've had a letter from our cousin Margaret in St. Louis. She's planning to visit in the spring, perhaps around the time of the wedding. You'll like her, I think. She's a teacher, very independent-minded." As they continued to chat about wedding plans and family connections, Florence felt a growing sense of belonging. Soon, she would be part of Everett's family officially, with new relationships and connections that would further root her in this community. The winter deepened, bringing storms that sometimes kept Florence housebound for days at a time. During one particularly fierce blizzard in January, Everett insisted she stay at the boarding house, where the larger building and multiple stoves kept the bitter cold at bay more effectively than her small cottage could. "Just until the worst passes," he said firmly, having trudged through waist-deep snow to check on her. "Alina's got plenty of room, and I'd rest easier knowing you were safe." Florence agreed, packing a few essentials and her current sewing projects. Thimble came too, nestled in a basket and thoroughly displeased about the whole situation. The arrangement proved wise when the temperature dropped so low that the town's water pump froze solid, and several older buildings suffered damage from the weight of snow on their roofs. Florence's cottage, when Everett checked on it, was so cold inside that a glass of water he'd left on the table had frozen over. "Could have been dangerous," he told her gravely upon his return to the boarding house. "You're staying here until this breaks. No arguments." Florence had no intention of arguing. The storm raged for 3 more days, during which time Everett, unable to return to the ranch, stayed in his old room at his sister's house. The enforced proximity gave the engaged couple a taste of what daily life together might be like: sharing meals, evening conversations by the fire, the simple domesticity of existing in the same space. "Could get used to this," Everett commented one evening as they sat playing checkers in the parlor while Alina knitted nearby. "Having you around all the time." "Only 3 more months," Florence reminded him with a smile. "If spring ever comes." "It always does," Alina assured her. "Though some years it takes its sweet time about it." When the storm finally broke, leaving Sweet River Junction buried under several feet of snow, the entire town emerged like bears from hibernation, blinking in the bright sunshine reflected off the white landscape. Men set to work clearing paths between buildings, checking on neighbors, assessing damage. Women organized supplies, prepared hot meals for the workers, and counted their preserved goods to ensure they would last until the roads cleared enough for new deliveries. Florence returned to her cottage, which, thanks to Everett's precautions, had weathered the storm without significant damage. It took most of a day to warm it back to a comfortable temperature, but soon she was able to resume her work, with Thimble once again happily curled among the fabric scraps. As January gave way to February, Florence began serious work on her wedding dress. True to her decision, she completely dismantled the gown she had brought from Boston, salvaging the fine fabric and lace but redesigning it to better suit both the woman she had become and the practical realities of frontier life. The new design was simpler, but no less elegant, a silhouette that flattered her figure without excessive frills, with delicate hand embroidery that showcased her skill as a seamstress. She worked on it in the evenings after completing her clients' orders, each stitch a small act of love and anticipation. Everett, meanwhile, was making preparations of his own. Whenever weather permitted, he rode out to their land, marking the site for their future home, hauling stones for the foundation, and cutting timber that would season in time for spring building. He had engaged the help of several friends, including the Simmons brothers from the lumber mill, who promised to assist with the construction once the weather improved. "Nothing fancy," he told Florence when describing his plans, "but solid. 2 bedrooms to start, one for us, one for your sewing room. Can add on later when, well, when we need more space." The implication that they might someday fill those additional rooms with children brought a blush to Florence's cheeks and a tender smile to Everett's face. February passed in a blur of wedding preparations, client work, and increasingly frequent thaws that hinted at spring's approach. By early March, the snow had receded enough that travel became easier, and supplies began flowing into town again, bringing fresh goods to the general store and mail that had been delayed for weeks. Among the belated deliveries was a letter for Florence, forwarded from Boston. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Agnes Turner, her former employer at the dressmaker's shop. "News from home?" Everett asked, seeing her expression as she opened the letter. "From my old workplace," Florence confirmed, scanning the contents. "Oh, Agnes is considering retirement. She's offering to sell me her client list and pattern books if I want to return to Boston and take over the business." Everett's face remained carefully neutral. "Quite an opportunity," he observed, his voice even. "Established clientele, reputation already built." Florence looked up from the letter, realizing how her words might have sounded. "It is," she agreed, "or it would have been 6 months ago." "And now?" Everett asked quietly. Florence set the letter aside and took his hands in hers. "Now my life is here," she said firmly. "With you, with our plans, with the business I'm building in Sweet River Junction. Boston is my past. This is my future." The tension visibly left Everett's shoulders. "You're sure? Don't want you having regrets." "The only regret I would have," Florence told him with absolute conviction, "is not marrying you and building our life together. Everything else is just details." Everett's response was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with such tenderness that it brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling. "3 more weeks," he murmured. "Feels like forever." "It will pass quickly," Florence assured him, though she felt the same impatience. After a moment, she added teasingly, "Unless another blizzard hits." Everett groaned at the thought. "Don't even joke about that. We've had enough delays." Fortunately, the weather continued to improve as their wedding day approached. The snow melted, revealing the first tentative green shoots of spring. Muddy roads dried, streams ran high with snowmelt, and birds returned to fill the air with their songs. On the morning of her wedding day, the first Saturday in April, 1879, Florence woke in her cottage for the last time as a single woman. Alina arrived early to help her prepare, bringing with her a bouquet of early spring wildflowers mixed with evergreen sprigs. "Something blue," she said, pinning a forget-me-not to Florence's hair. "Something borrowed," she added, fastening a delicate cameo brooch at the neckline of the wedding dress. "It was our mother's." "It's beautiful," Florence said, touching the carved ivory piece gently. "Thank you for sharing it with me." "She would have loved you," Alina assured her. "Almost as much as my brother does." The wedding was held in the church, which had been decorated with evergreens and whatever early flowers could be found. Most of the town attended not just out of curiosity or tradition, but because both Florence and Everett had genuinely become valued members of the community. Florence waited at the back of the church, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The dress she had so painstakingly redesigned fit perfectly, the ivory fabric complementing her complexion, the simple lines flattering her slender figure. In her hands, she held the bouquet Alina had brought, its subtle fragrance calming her, when the piano began to play Mrs. Wilson at the keys, performing a piece she had been practicing for weeks. Florence took a deep breath and began her walk down the aisle. The faces of friends and neighbors blurred as her focus narrowed to the man waiting for her at the altar. Everett stood tall and straight, dressed in a new suit that Florence suspected Alina had insisted upon. His usually unruly hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, but it was his expression that caught and held her attention, a mixture of awe, joy, and love so intense it took her breath away. As she reached his side and placed her hand in his, Florence felt a sense of rightness, of completion. This was where she was meant to be with this man, in this place that had become her home. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional. Reverend Collins spoke of love, commitment, and the building of a life together. Florence and Everett exchanged vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever the future might bring. When Everett slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady but his eyes shone with emotion. And when Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was both a promise and a fulfillment, tender, joyful, and witnessed by all who had come to care for them. The celebration afterward, held in the church hall as Florence's own wedding had not been months earlier, was a true community affair. Everyone had contributed something: food, decorations, music, good wishes. Even Harold Wilkins, somewhat rehabilitated in town opinion after his sincere apology to Charlotte Mills, sent a gift, a fine set of dishes with a note acknowledging his past wrongs and wishing the couple well. "Decent of him," Everett commented when Florence showed him the note. "Maybe he's learned something after all." As the celebration continued into the evening, Florence found moments to speak with many of those who had been part of her journey in Sweet River Junction: Ben and Charlotte, now openly courting; Reverend Collins and his wife; the Simmons brothers who had helped Everett prepare their land; Mrs. Sullivan, who had been one of her first sewing clients, and many others who had welcomed her into their community. "Happy, Mrs. James?" Alina asked, finding Florence taking a quiet moment near the window. The name, her new name, brought a smile to Florence's face. "Completely," she assured her sister-in-law. "More than I ever thought possible." "You deserve it," Alina said warmly. "Both of you do." Later, as the sun began to set, Everett found his bride amid the well-wishers. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly, taking her hand. Home was, for now, Alina's boarding house, where she had insisted they stay until their own house was finished. "To give you privacy," she had explained with a wink that had made both Florence and Everett blush. As they said their goodbyes and stepped out into the cool spring evening, Florence looked up at her husband, and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost overwhelmed her. "Happy?" Everett asked, echoing Alina's question as he helped her into the buggy that would take them the short distance to the boarding house. "More than words can express," Florence replied honestly. "And you?" Everett's answer was to lean down and kiss her, a kiss full of promise and passion that left no doubt about his feelings. "Let's go home," he murmured against her lips. "Mrs. James." As they drove through the quiet streets of Sweet River Junction, Florence leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she had first arrived in this town, a bride abandoned at the train station. How fortunate she was that a cowboy had taken her hand that day and walked her home, a home that was now, truly and forever, with him. 5 years later, Florence stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching as Everett taught their 3-year-old son, Thomas, to sit on a gentle pony. The little boy's squeals of delight carried across the yard, mingling with the sounds of chickens clucking, horses nickering in the corral, and the distant lowing of cattle. The ranch had prospered beyond their initial hopes. Everett's skill with horses had proven valuable, his carefully bred and trained stock sought after throughout the territory. Florence's dressmaking business continued as well, though on a smaller scale now that she had a family to care for. She had converted one room of their home into a workroom, taking on special commissions and teaching occasional sewing classes for the young women of Sweet River Junction. Their home, initially a modest two-room structure, had grown along with their family. They had added a kitchen and dining room the year after their marriage, and then 2 more bedrooms when Florence discovered she was expecting Thomas. Now, with another child on the way, Florence rested her hand on her growing belly, feeling the baby's movements. They were discussing yet another addition. "Again, Papa. Again," Thomas called as Everett led the pony in a circle. "Once more around, then inside for supper," Everett called back, his face alight with the special joy he always showed when with his son. Florence smiled, thinking of how far they had come from that first meeting at the train station. The memory, once painful, now seemed like the beginning of a story she would someday tell her grandchildren, how a cruel rejection had led to the greatest happiness of her life. Eleanor visited often, having sold the boarding house 2 years earlier to live with them on the ranch. She had become Auntie Elle to Thomas, spoiling him shamelessly and promising to do the same with his sibling when he or she arrived. Sweet River Junction had grown too, now boasting a school, a proper hotel, and even a small newspaper. Ben and Charlotte had married and taken over not only the general store but also several other businesses, becoming leading citizens of the town. Harold Wilkins had eventually left for Denver, but not before making amends to those he had wronged, including Florence. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Everett finished the pony ride and lifted Thomas onto his shoulders for the walk back to the house. The sight of them, her tall, strong husband and their laughing, tousle-haired son, filled Florence's heart to overflowing. "Mama," Thomas called, waving excitedly. "I rode all by myself." "I saw, sweetheart," Florence replied, opening her arms as Everett set the boy down on the porch. "You're becoming quite the horseman, just like your father." "Got your mother's grace, though," Everett observed, leaning down to kiss Florence's cheek, "and her smile." As they went inside together, Florence reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a hopeful bride to be traveling to meet a man she had never seen, to a woman mocked and abandoned at a train station, to the wife and mother she was today, surrounded by love and belonging. Every step of that journey, even the painful ones, had been necessary to bring her to this place, this life, this family. And for that, she was profoundly grateful to whatever fate or providence had guided her, and to the cowboy who had taken her hand when she needed it most and walked her home.